Pablo Picasso's art is ugly as hell. As far as I know, it's not supposed to be pretty, as he was not trying to convey how things look to the naked eye, but how they look from several different perspectives at the same time within the limitations of a two-dimensional canvas. That being said, yeah, it's ugly as hell. I think it is important to point out that there are differences between liking, appreciating, and respecting art, or really anything. You can appreciate and respect without liking something. You can also just respect it without appreciating or liking, or like without appreciating or respecting, or any combination of these. I'm sure there are more words I could use, but the point I am getting at is that it sounds like you respect Picasso, but just don't like or appreciate his work. To avoid any confusion, I'm defining appreciate as, to recognize the full worth. Guernica is about an explosion in a town full of civilians. I think ugly was exactly the point. I had a very nice experience with a family friend, 82 yo. We were visiting a contemporary museum of art with some very weird art. He talked so passionate about all the works we saw. He explained them to us and made us actually understand. At the end, someone asked, "Do you actually like any piece of art here?" His response was amazing, "Of course not. Have you seen his early art? When he was a 6-year-old was painting some amazing shit. I'm not fan of his cubism too, but when he painted realism it was gorgeous." An important thing to remember about a lot of Picasso's art is it wasn't created for aesthetic value but rather as academic investigation. Cubism, for example, explored the nature of space on the 2D plane and sought to remove the illusion of three-dimensionality and use space in its truest form on the canvas. Comparing such works to some grand painted landscape is like comparing a research article to Lord of the Rings. It's clear which comes out on top for their entertainment value, but to do so misses a large part of the point. Art is massively subjective. I personally like Dallas' work, though my wife is not a fan. It's more about doing something different and outside of the box. Art would be boring if it was nothing but realistic portraits of people or landscapes. I like it because it's unique. Landscapes and fruit bowls make me want to die inside. Sure, it shows great technical skill when done properly, but it has no flavor. Try Jackson Pollock LUL. When the Nazis saw Guernica they said, "This is horrible, did you do this?" He responded, "No, you did." The problem with art today is that people only appreciate realistic art, which is the easiest for an artist to create. Abstract works, especially cubism, done from multiple perspectives at the same time, simplified to the core, are looked at as ugly. If an artist doesn't just replicate reality, the work is not valued as much, even though abstraction is a complicated process not achieved by most painters. I know that I, as a student of art, always struggled with those styles, and I'm speaking from experience. I respect your opinion. I'm just talking about a problem in society that bothers me and drags down individualism and expression in art. This really made me laugh. Picasso's style is meant to be unesthetic. Think this is summed up quite well in his quote, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child." I think that's the point of it. Of course he didn't design them to look beautiful, he designed them to portray some emotional feeling. Guernica, for example, portrays darkness in a hideous manner in response to the German bombings. Art isn't supposed to be pretty, it's just got to have emotion and interpretation. Don't you like Guernica? I agree, for the most part, but I found his Guernica to be particularly powerful. I appreciate surrealism. Beksinski is probably my favorite artist, but he was able to tell stories through his artwork and it looked fantastic. Picasso's artwork looks awful, but he is somehow redeemed because his style is unique or had multiple perspectives. If Picasso's style of painting was more common, his artwork would be utterly unremarkable, it's only remembered because it stands in opposition to conventionality. In my mind, art which needs to oppose other art to be good has no value in and of itself. To that end, I'd honestly rather look at fucking Thomas Kincaid. They're ugly, but his realism paintings are kind of cool. I'm not exactly understanding his cubism, but his paintings that are early are fantastic. Let's just say that Pablo didn't age well. His newer paintings are very weird. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. A little off topic, but I have the same opinion with jazz music in general. Weird thing is, actually I play jazz. I enjoy playing it but not listening it. Maybe something similar happens with Picasso paints appreciations. Pablo Picasso's early work was more traditional and realistic, if that's what you're into. He was actually quite talented. He started painting in his teens and his early work was realistic. His later work was him expressing himself without the constraints of what was accepted as art back then. He said it took a lifetime to learn to paint like a child. They say things like art is up to interpretation and art is supposed to invoke feeling and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, this beholder feels disgusted and thinks she wants to gouge out her own eyes now. Picasso was a con man. I've never liked his art, and he's a legend in his own mind that convinced everyone else he was right. He wanted to be famous and make money. It's much quicker to make his cubist paintings than a more technical painting. The art market is flooded with his work to such an extent that people don't realize they can own a Picasso for relatively cheap. Unimpressed myself. The purpose of art isn't to be visually appealing. Art is supposed to elicit emotions, both positive and negative. Add to that its subjective nature, and it's easy to see why people love or hate art with such passion. I've been reading a lot of your answers you have been posting, and, not trying to convince you or anything, I also didn't like Picasso's art style until I actually saw it in person. Particularly the Guernica. The style is not for everyone, and a lot of the beauty of any art is lost in pictures of it. You cannot compare knowing the David is a masterpiece to actually standing there and seeing it in all its real glory. Again, not trying to convince you, just sharing what was the turning point for me, for a lot of vanguard movements. Understandably, not everyone has the opportunity to, and I am throwing a big assumption that you haven't seen it IRL. The point of his art was that it isn't traditionally good looking. I don't think you see the point. He was an asshole too. I'm not a big fan of his work either, but his early work shows that he was very talented. Here's another unpopular opinion. Basquiat is overrated and untalented, and if Warhol didn't let him into the clique he'd be nobody. 3 things. 1. It was Cubism, so it's definitely supposed to be weird, but yes. 2. Art is subjective and everyone has their own opinion, so double yes, though some things seem wrong to hate, this is not one of them. And 3. He was a horrible person, so don't feel a shred of guilt even if the other 2 things didn't say anything really for you. I liked a lot of his earlier works, when he had a more realistic style. The more abstract style he adopted later on feels like a downgrade emo. A lot of people say they like it because it's good. I'll never claim to know anything about art, but it's like saying the Beatles were bad, obviously they weren't. Bob Ross vs Pablo Picasso rap battle. Just because someone is famous doesn't mean you have to like them or their work. I don't give a shit about any famous people, but there are lots of people out there who literally would worship actual POO that came out of their butts. Nice thing about art is you're right. So are the people who think his art is life-changing. It's completely subjective. You can talk about more concrete things like its impact or technique, but when it comes to appeal, everyone's opinion is just as valid. He was a giant asshole, so there's also that. I had to laugh when I read this post. My mother, of blessed memory, absolutely loved Picasso. We had a print of the old guitarist at home, and whenever my mom was cleaning, she would pretend it was the original and with great reverence say, "I've got to dust the Picasso." That painting, while a classic, I have to admit is pretty depressing. I feel the same about Jackson Pollock. You're not wrong. Art is subjective. He was also a horrible misogynist. Every time I change wives I should burn the last one. That way I'd be rid of them. They wouldn't be around to complicate my existence. Maybe, that would bring back my youth, too. You kill the woman and you wipe out the past she represents. Picasso. Agree. Not sure what I am appreciating? Yet it's okay. Art be like that. I've seen some stuff put up and sold that just makes me go, what fucking idiot thought this was quality? I don't know if it's that unpopular. I mean, I wouldn't want to display Picasso's art on my walls. Say he were a poor starving artist today, he came to my door, and offered to sell me one of his paintings, in an alternate reality where there was no pre-existing market for them, for $20. I have to say I would turn him down, uninterested. It's not my thing, it's not something I would want for myself. But that said, I get it that taste is subjective. And if someone offered me a Picasso for cheap in this world, I would take them up on the offer. But not for me to keep, to resell to someone who would actually appreciate it. Love how people here are arguing over something subjective, literally going, your opinion is wrong. You can appreciate something even if it's not the artist's intention to make it beautiful or pleasant. You're not wrong. It's ugly as hell. Modern art is a fucking psyop. I read it as Pablo Escobar and was confused for a solid minute. It's not always supposed to be pleasant. Have you seen Guernica? Also, look at his early work. Like when he was a child. His talent was stunning and amazing. Later his stuff became weird and esoteric, which isn't to everyone's taste, but his early work shows that man had talent. He did a bunch of lifelike shit that he had mastered by the age of 16 and desperately wanted to turn the art world upside down. My personal take on this is that Picasso basically peaked as a conventional artist when he was a teenager, so he later spent his life exploring the boundaries of art. That's why it's weird, perhaps even ugly, but also genius. I agree with you. As an artist and art lover, he's not in my list of favorites. I don't mind his blue period, but the rest doesn't appeal to me. Give me a Basquiat, Twombly, Rothko any day before Picasso. I appreciate what he brought to the art world and how he turned it on its head though. As far as ugly goes, you're not wrong because that's your opinion and that's just how art works. As far as appreciation goes, I just remember something my grandfather told me. A quote by Picasso translated roughly says, "It took me 4 years to learn to draw like Raphael, but it has taken me my whole life to learn to draw like a child." Sometimes in art people get so wrapped up with what is proper and what is aesthetically pleasing. I think there's room for it all, and Picasso was trying to strip art down to more emotion than technical proficiency. As a person though he was a total skis, his reputation precedes him, so do with that what you will. You just don't understand his work? Art is used by the wealthy as a tax avoidance scheme. Make 2 mil. Buy art. Hold art. Don't pay taxes. Repeat. I took a foundation drawing class in college and our professor took us to our local art museum that had his exhibition for one of our classes. Next class he asked us our thoughts about the exhibition. I gave my honest opinion and said his early work was beautiful but his later work, which is what made him the most famous, was not art but chicken scratch from a demented person. He felt so offended and said my opinion was the equivalent of saying humans can live without water. I was like, bro, just chill. Like WTF LOL. I'm pretty sure that was intentional. Not all artists go for the beauty aesthetic. I'm not claiming I know jack about painting or art in general, but I see how not everything is meant to be taken at face value. Still, upvoted, definitely not one I've heard before on this page. His art is trash. There is nothing to get. You are not dumb or uncultured. The ones who tell you you are wrong are pompous assholes. You're not talking about Picasso but about Cubism. Look at his early paintings, when he was 13 to 18, this should be within your capacity. Andy Warhol's are worse. A lot of famous art is more about the history than the piece. It's okay to think it sucks 'cause it does. Price doesn't equal talent. To piggyback off your sentiment, most modern IG artists are not artists, and their art looks ridiculous. A painted tampon hanging from a wire with frayed fabric is not art. I get why people love to praise art not for their beauty, but for their meaning. That being said, I'm not one of those people. I like art that's pretty to look at. Some may scoff at the idea as being tasteless and basic, but there's nothing wrong with wanting to look at something beautiful. I don't think that's an unpopular opinion. Art selling is money laundering. Yet I mean art is weird. Apparently one guy took a shit and canned it and it is now art. Agreed. An art dealer on Pawn Stars said he would have a pastel and notepad in jacket and run up a bar tab and jot a quick drawing to pay for it. I'd go a step further and say Da Vinci's Mona Lisa is nowhere near beautiful. As someone who has studied art in an academic space, that's okay. Arguably, that's the point. Shit, Duchamp bought a urinal at a hardware store and entered it into a gallery as art. The point behind it is the idea and the execution, not necessarily if it's pretty or not. You don't have to like how it looks. It's not supposed to be pretty, but I do love his blue period. You should look at his paintings from PRE1900. Like Science and Charity and First Communion, they are completely different from what you may know. I'm also not a big fan of a lot of his other work myself and was surprised by those when I learned about them. Nah man, have you seen his pigeons paintings? Those pigeons are cute as fuck. Take a look at his early work, it's really good realist art. I think it falls under a form of surrealism. But, that may not be true. What I know is true is that the presence of geometrical figures arranged into pieces is common in his art. I wouldn't consider them masterpieces, personally, but ugly is not something I would call them. But, we all have our opinions. Yeah, that's like me trying to understand what people like about Salvador Dali. Yeah, it's weird. He was also a miserable, horrible sexist. For me, art needs explanation. I very much enjoy going to museums and finding a docent or eavesdropping on someone who is telling a friend how awesome a painting is and then thanking them. Sometimes I get lucky and latch on to a tour. For someone not in the art world, this has helped me understand so much cool stuff, just like Picasso, that I would have otherwise moved on from. Look at Picasso's early work. Some of his realist paintings look like photographs. I definitely disagree with you, so there's an upvote. The post right above this one is literally a Picasso painting LMAO. It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. Picasso. When I was around 10, my aunt came to stay with us for a weekend and my city happened to have a Picasso exhibit going on. So we go to this exhibit with my aunt and mom, and I kinda separate from them a little. I find a painting there's only one person standing in front of, so I had to check that one out. It's called Experimental Medical Student, and the dude staring at the painting is sorta beatnik looking and super intensely pensive about it. I'm trying to decide if the painting or the dude is weirder. Then my aunt comes up behind me and says, oh yeah, unfortunately the experiments were being done on the student. The look on the dude's face was priceless. He didn't think it was funny. Have an upvote.